whole of supply chain industry has for decades been trying to improve the accuracy of their forecast. And every large big company has even their own division dedicated to that problem alone. But, however, the outcome of this effort, perhaps counterintuitive, has shown that better accuracy in forecast has not resulted in better performing supply chains. Are we looking at the problem the wrong way, or even perhaps the wrong problem to begin with? And what changes if we measure accuracy in dollars rather than percentages? This is the topic of today's episode, so let's kick that off with Joannes. What does it mean that a forecast is more accurate?
A more accurate forecast means that according to a given forecasting metric, you have one model that is more accurate than the other. So more specifically, when we say we have a more accurate forecast, it is a bit an abuse of language. In fact, what we are truly saying is that we have a forecasting model that is more accurate than another forecasting model. And according to what? According to a certain forecasting metric, which is just a metric, just a measurement that quantifies the forecasting error that you have on the two forecasting models.
So in fact, a forecasting accuracy depends directly on the metric that you use.
Absolutely, and there are a wide variety of forecasting metrics that are known, I would say, in the literature. The most widespread ones are probably mean square error. You have the absolute error. You have the MAPI, mean absolute percentage error. You have the weighted MAPI. You have, a whole bestiary of functions that let you measure the forecasting error. And all of those forecasting metrics have in common that if you have like perfect result, they just tell you that your error is 0.
So we have a vast array of different metrics to use. Which one is the best one? How do you know that?
As far as supply chain is concerned, this is a very tricky question, because the reality is that all the metrics that I've listed are actually mathematical objects. You will find them in the textbooks because they give you tons of, I would say, interesting mathematical properties. But it's not because something is mathematically interesting that it is provably relevant to a domain of interest. You have tons of things that can be very interesting from a mathematical point of view, and that doesn't mean that it's going to be of any relevance from a supply chain perspective. And I believe that this here lies the crux of the problem, is that people expect, and that's, I believe, the wrong sort of expectation, that they can just go to a mathematical textbook, review the dozens of metrics, and just pick one and say, this one is the one that fits for a problem. It just do not work like that.
So in fact, if we look at sort of the problem of maximizing our accuracy in percentages, that can be quite misleading for supply chain performance.
Yes, I mean, again, our conclusion is not that we should kind of maximize the forecasting error. This is not what I'm discussing. You see, the finding was more puzzling than that. The finding was that if you just shrink your forecast error through just the optimization of mathematical metrics, it doesn't generate extra supply chain performance. But the converse is not simple. It's not just because you increase your forecasting error that you actually improve your supply chain performance either. You see, this is where it gets very puzzling, because there is this kind of false duality where you say, well, it's one thing or the other. Yes, it would be this if supply chain was a one-dimensional problem, where if you reduce the forecasting error, you improve supply chain performance, and thus, if you just go the other way around, you will degrade supply chain performance. If we were living in a one-dimensional world, yes, that would be that. But supply chains are many, many dimensional, so it doesn't work like that at all. And that's where I would say the basic intuition can get those things very, very wrong.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned supply chain performance. How do you measure supply chain performance?
And that's the crux of the problem, actually, is that, you see, those supply chain metrics is that people have really hard time to wrap their head around what should be a good forecast. Thus, you come up with a metric that you pick from a textbook and you say, this is it. But but you very quickly realize that it's not because it was found in a textbook, that because it was in a mathematical textbook, that it bears any relevance to your supply chain problem. And thus, if you want to have something else, the question is, what else? You know, this feels like a very open question, and actually it is a very, very open question. And the sort of practice that we have pioneered at Lokad was to think in terms of essentially dollars of error. What is it that you're trying to optimize? And well, in order to connect the quality and the performance of your forecast with the performance of your supply chain, you need to inject a dose of economic driver, a fairly large dose. And that's when you start measuring things in dollars of error, then you can start assessing whether you're actually moving the needle in the sort of direction that makes sense for your supply chain.
So in fact, the supply chain performance, the better the supply chain performance, surely the more money the company generates, the more we cut in costs in our supply chain, and hence our revenue increases. So that's quite interesting, because that means that if we look at forecasting accuracy in percentages, that does not necessarily coincide with forecasting accuracy in dollars, which is sort of the core of this problem that we're discussing right now.
Yes, and that is very counterintuitive. Again, I think that's going to be a controversial statement, but shrinking, reducing the forecasting error as expressed in percents of error do not improve supply chain performance. Sometimes it can even do the exact opposite, actually.
So if we look at an example, say a supermarket. So a supermarket is quite an interesting problem because human behavior can be quite unpredictable. So if I'm managing a supermarket and I want to know, am I going to sell 0 shampoo bottles today or 5? And I have a forecast. And Joannes, what's the sort of difference of the accuracy of this forecast in my scenario right now, if I look at it in terms of percentages versus dollars?
So first, let's start by clarifying one thing. The fact that there is tons of uncertainty or very little of uncertainty is just going to define the sort of magnitude of forecasting error that you're going to observe. So that's fine. You see, this is just completely situation dependent. If you're looking at, let's say, the national electricity consumption, the variation from one day to the next are very, very small. There is like a daily pattern, but otherwise the consumption is very, very stable. So you will observe very, very small variations. And if you're looking at something that is extremely disaggregated, like the bottle of shampoos in one supermarket, you will observe in percentage much higher variation. This is fine. The trick is, let's have a look at this specific supermarket example. This is an anecdote that I already gave in another episode, which was years ago we did a forecasting benchmark in this sort of setup. And what we realized is that the vast majority, when you're operating, vast majority of products, when you're operating at the store level, your average demand per day is much lower than 1. You know, you're selling 1 unit per week on average per product or something, sometimes so even lower.
It's more likely to sell 0
than
1 unit of this product.
Absolutely. So the most likely outcome for the vast majority of products on any given day is selling 0.
So and how does the forecast that is looking to maximize the accuracy in percentages look
and
like?
If you take a metric, let's say the absolute value of your forecast minus the reality.
Yeah, say percentages or absolute values.
And then you can divide, by yearly sales or whatever, normalize. You just normalize so that you have a percentage. What you will get is a metric that if you try to optimize against this metric, which means if you try to find what is the forecasting model that will give you the best results according to this metric, you will end up with a model that just forecasts 0 every single day. And why? Because 0 sales is by far the most likely outcome on any given day. The model that is going to be the most accurate, according to this very, very simple and straightforward metric that I've given, it's absolute value of reality minus forecast. If you just optimize that, you will have a forecast that is going to produce 0. And even weirder and even more harmful for the supply chain is that if you have a model that forecasts 0, then you will replenish 0, and thus very quickly your store will have nothing on the shelf, And thus, very quickly, your forecast will be 100% accurate because you forecast 0, you sell 0, 100% accurate. Everything is, well, except it isn't. It's
But
a
you have
catastrophe for the
0 in
company.
your account.
Yes.
And that's quite interesting how even when we get, 100% accuracy on our forecast, we get 0 revenue.
Yes, and even worse than that, we have 0 revenue, but we have all the costs. We are still operating a store. We have to pay for the people, pay for the building, and everything. So you see, it's even worse than that. And then we are losing clients because they don't find what they are looking for, and they don't come back. Exactly. And here we see that it's a sort of absurdity. It's not as obvious when we look at more aggregated time series, but the problem is exactly the same. And fundamentally, the problem here in this hypermarket example is that we have massive asymmetries. The cost of being short of 1 unit is absolutely not the same compared to the cost of having 1 unit sitting unsold for 1 extra day. This is very, very asymmetric. So and thus, you see, the problem with the forecasting accuracy metric that I've just outlined, initially, absolute value of forecast minus reality, is that it's completely symmetric. So it puts essentially the same weight on the over forecast
out and being overstocked.
Exactly. And here we see that as it's a very, very simple problem where we have a massive asymmetry, and the forecasting metric doesn't even capture that. And why would it be? From a mathematical perspective, all the metrics that you're looking at are typically symmetrical. This is from a mathematical perspective, why would you want to have a highly asymmetrical metric? It's usually of no mathematical interest. But from a supply chain perspective, it is very much of interest. And this is only scratching the surface. We're just looking at one tiny problem, but this tiny problem is already sufficiently big to completely undo all the intended benefit that would come from, I would say, a process that would optimize forecast according to symmetric metrics.
So it sounds to me like not only are we maybe looking at this problem in the wrong way, that we might even be looking at the wrong problem to begin with, that we're so focused on guessing what the demand is going to be that we're not sort of thinking about the cost of being overstocked or understocked. And
Absolutely.
then we sort of take it away from what is the actual sort of profits that we can gain and only look at guessing the exact demand.
Yes, I mean, more fundamentally, a forecast is just an opinion. Ideally, it's an educated opinion about the future, which is kind of, correct. However, in the end, a forecast is just that. An educated opinion about the future. It doesn't do anything about your supply chain. The only thing that is doing anything for your supply chain is what you actually do.
The decisions.
The decision that you take. Do I put 1 extra unit in this hypermarket or not for any given product on any given day? That are the decisions. Thus, the question becomes, when you want to think in terms of forecasting accuracy, is how does improving your forecasting model contributes to your end game, which is to take the right decision at the right time for every single product, every single day. And that's, you see, this is a missing link, and that's typically what is completely absent from those accuracy metrics. And that's why when I see discussion, I would say, in supply chain communities where people say, you know what, there is 20 different metrics that we can use for supply chain. In this situation, you can use this. In this situation, you can use that, etc., etc. Usually, all those discussions are entirely missing the point. They are not even starting to connect those forecasts with, which are, again, just an opinion, with the end game results, which are the decisions that are being made on top of those forecasts.
So we're kind of taking our focus away from the consequence of each of those decisions that we make. But these big companies, we still have divisions dedicated specifically to improving the accuracy of these forecasts. Should there be a division like that in the first place?
And that's a topic that we briefly addressed in one of the, I would say, the earlier episode of the chain, which was silos and divisions within large companies. You see, the problem is that when you start introducing numerical artifacts, and numerical artifacts can be of any kind. It can be ABC classes, it can be safety stocks, it can be forecasts. Again, I'm saying all of that are numerical artifacts. There is no such thing as a safety stock in your warehouse. You don't have two stocks, the working stock and the safety stock. No, there is just one stock, what you have. And so when you introduce those numerical artifacts, there is a temptation to create, I would say, a subgroup of specialists within the company who are going to be experts in dealing with this numerical artifact. The problem is that it's not real. You can, but just because you do it, or half of the industry do it, you can be misled into thinking that it's any kind of real, but it's not, literally. And there are tons of things like that that are just not real. Safety stocks are not real. Service levels are not real. Forecasts, no matter how you do it, they are not real. They are numerical artifacts that you produce, to achieve certain type of operation and to take certain type of decisions. And so if we go back to those large companies always struggle with how do you spread out the workload. And just because you've introduced a numerical artifact doesn't mean that you should actually introduce a team. And I believe that, on the contrary, this is one of the root cause of those, I would say, evil that really undermine the supply chain performance in the first place. Because if you start to create a team of specialists who are going to only work with on improving the quality of the forecast, what is going to happen? Well, the reality is that they are going to pick a metric. Why is that? Well, because if they don't have a metric, they can't operate. So they are going to pick a metric.
We need something to measure with.
Yes, and because they have a metric, it looks very rational. Yes, we are optimizing the forecast, absolute value of forecast minus reality. Obviously, if we were to produce perfectly accurate forecast, our forecast error would be 0. And so everybody agrees, yeah, sounds reasonable, sounds rational, except that we have seen in the hypermarket example that it's absolutely not real and not rational. You can do things that are completely insane with that. But nonetheless, if you're a large company, you're maybe not going to realize that the devil is in the details, and people are not even going to realize that it's absolutely, completely bogus and nonsensical in the first place. Nonetheless, you have a team, and then the team that is in charge of forecasting, where they operate in their own bubble.
So they're not the ones taking the actual decisions that bring money into
account. No, they are the one producing the forecast. And according to their goal and their metric, they're improving. You see, they will be producing a series of models, and over time, they will get better at it. They will factor in seasonality. They will factor in the sort of religious holidays. They will factor in tons of factors, and they will get better. And thus, according to the metric, the forecast will get better. And potentially, they will bring in better software, all sorts of things. Over time, it did better according to the metric, which do not coincide with the interest of the company expressed in dollars.
So the supply chain performance does not improve with the improved forecast.
Yes, and again, people would say, but why? We have better forecasts. I'd say, why should it improve?
It's
Those people are not doing anything to actually improve according to the dollars of error. They are shooting for accuracy metrics. You see, that's the trick, is that it's not because you do something that is kind of like something else that you will get the result that you would be obtaining if you were doing something else. It's literally there was a very I'm digressing a little bit, but there is an anecdote for the audience, and they could look it up on the Wikipedia about cargo cults. That was during Second World War, where there were U.S. aircraft that were flying over islands in the Pacific, and they were dropping cargoes, food, ammos, various goods, so that soldiers who would just arrive on the islands, they would already have some stuff in place. But those islands were they already had, humans, very, very primitives. And so those people, they had never seen, an aircraft or anything. So they just saw stuff in the sky that were just dropping cargoes, and what they see is that suddenly they realized that when they were actually, people realized that they were even witnesses the birth of new religions, where people were kind of trying to trigger the apparition of an aircraft that would deliver more cargo. As you see, this is what happens when you just try to imitate on the surface something that was beneficial to you, because it did happen in the past, but there is now the core substance. And this is those cargo cults that emerged by trying literally to re-instantiate the delivery of a cargo on the island by just, reproducing some sort of stuff that had happened. I believe this is what is happening with, I would say, most forecasting teams who are trying to, generate better supply chain performance by just optimizing those metrics. It is, on the surface, it has a rationality of its own, but if you are looking at the whole picture, it is absolutely not rational. This is just, a veneer of rationality, and you just, take the sort of forms. So you have numbers, you have smart people, you have processes, but it's not because you're ticking all the boxes that the whole thing makes actually any sense.
So I have to ask, Lokad initially, we started with doing forecasts and focusing on making our forecasts more and more accurate. And Joannes, throughout this journey of Lokad, how did you come to realize that in fact did not generate this better, or did not result in better performing supply chain for our clients?
Because it wasn't working, plain and simple.
So how did you realize that we were looking at the wrong problem?
I mean, I realized first, how did I realize that it wasn't working? And because that's a tricky question, because actually, even when it wasn't working, Lokad was acquiring clients just fine and growing just fine and profitable, kind of, just fine. So if you're growing, if you're profitable, and you're a software company.
Sounds good.
Sounds good, yeah. But, and it wasn't working for the clients, and when I was, trying to stepping back, and I was asking myself, the brutal, honest question did I really make the situation really better for the clients? If I step back, if I forget the metrics, just trying to have like a gut feeling, instinctive perception of the situation. Is it really getting better? And I was starting to realize it wasn't, it wasn't. And that was, but according to all the metrics, it was. But if I was stepping out of the metrics for a second, if I was trying to coldly assess whether what we're doing was truly making a positive change, in a deeper meaning, something that would, and it wasn't. But people would say, oh, but according to all the metrics, we're good.
So we're hitting the metrics, but we're not bringing.
But that's the problem, is that if you pick a metric and you optimize against this metric, then yes, you're going to be better according to this metric. This is literally what mathematical optimization and machine learning will do for you. You pick a metric and you run the sort of numerical optimization, and you will get something better according to this metric. So you see, this was a bit of a tautological nature. We pick a metric, we do better by this metric. What did you expect? Unless the algorithms are downright buggy, we should actually do just that. But it doesn't mean that on a deeper level that we're going better. And literally, also one of the key elements for Lokad to realize was we had a monthly subscription model that people can cancel anytime. And that was the trick, to have early cancellation. Because you see, that was most of my competitors, they go for multi-year plans.
Yeah.
So they never realize that something is wrong, because fundamentally they go through an ERP, they sell their stuff, then they embark on a 5-year journey. And whether it works or not, the client has spent so much effort on this that they can't change, so they are stuck. There are sunken costs at play, where there is such a, I would say, a psychological trap of just sticking with that.
Since you already invested so much.
You already invested so much. And thus, after 5 years, you're exhausted in rolling out this super complex solution, so you don't want to change right away. And then when you finally decide that you want to change, year 8 or 10, then you go through another RFP. So if you lose the client at this point, you just say, well, it's not that we were having, doing anything wrong with the forecast. It's just that the technology, evolved some of our competition got ahead on this specific client, and so we didn't win the client again on the second RFP. But you don't necessarily make, the connection. The connection is super, super loose on whether you're doing any good, and whether, your forecasts are actually doing something that is of value for the client. If you're by the month, suddenly, when the supply chain director realizes that, he or she gets the same sort of gut feeling that it's just not bringing, value on the table, no matter what the KPIs are saying, then you're out. And so the feedback loop is much, I would say, it's much tighter.
And can you tell how a product has evolved as it is right now compared to just a forecast on its own?
We realize that in terms of forecasting accuracy, the problem is not to optimize according to a given forecasting accuracy, to a given metric. You will pick one, it's going to have tons of problems. This is not the problem. And if your tooling is right, you pick one metric and you will optimize against this metric. And this is it. This is very, very straightforward. I mean, it could be made even more straightforward, but this is very straightforward.
So what are we optimizing right now?
The tool, that's the thing. The tool is optimizing the metric, but the thing is that the tool that we have developed is what it takes to discover the metrics, the accuracy metrics that you need for your company. You see, that's the journey was, we started with the idea that we can just have a preconceived set of metrics and just optimize against those, and it will be good. This is not the case. And this is much worse than I initially thought. It's not about, I would say, identifying, better metrics. It's, yes, there are some metrics that are slightly better. For example, if we go back to this hypermarket situation, if you take, let's say, the pinball loss function, that's a highly asymmetric, that's a loss function that can be made arbitrarily asymmetric, you can get marginally better results. If you go for probabilistic forecasting, you can even go for specific metrics for probabilistic forecast, cross entropy, continuous rank probability score. There are others. So there are metrics that are that can be marginally better. But this is it. They are just marginally better. The problem is that when you face a real company, you don't know what you want to optimize. You see, this is a sort of paradigm shift that we had to undergo during this last decade at Lokad, and thus the tooling that we have nowadays is literally answering the question of what it takes for supply chain scientists to discover, crunching the data and discussing with the supply chain expert in the company what the accuracy metrics should look like. And you will realize that it's something that do not have the sort of numerical elegance that those mathematical metrics have, because there is tons of factors, tons of edge cases, tons of things that are very specific of the sort of business that you operate. If you're doing hard luxury, it's completely different from, let's say, fresh food or aerospace. So there are tons of edge cases and edge situations that only make sense because you're looking at a very, very specific company. But nonetheless, those edge cases are completely critical if you want to produce results, decisions in the end that are not completely insane.
So what we're really after is those exact supply chain decisions.
Yes, that would be the end game. That would be, the sort of way to measure that you're doing any good. And that is true for all the intermediate sort of numerical artifacts that you produce. Forecasts that are measured with their own, forecasting accuracy metrics. They are just one type of numerical artifacts. There are typically dozens more of numerical artifacts that are in the way, in the middle of the process.
So we went from focusing on improving a forecasting accuracy to finding those key supply chain decisions that maximize the profit or maximize supply chain performance, which is quite an interesting sort of change of perspective. But these big companies, they still have these divisions. And just to wrap it up a little bit, Joannes, what would be your advice to these companies? How should they approach this problem differently?
My advice is, if it's not one person who is responsible for everything, from I would say, making sense of the data that lies in the ERP to the final generation of the production orders, replenishment order, purchase order, stock movements, price moves. If you don't have one person that is responsible end-to-end for this entire chain, then you haven't even started to optimize your supply chain. And all the effort that you've pushed into better forecast or whatever, all of that is just an illusion.
So the incentives aren't aligned?
It's not about incentives of alignment. It's just that those people will be, if you fragment this decision, people will be doing things that are not sensible for the company. Just think of it as, imagine you're playing chess, and I say, you're the knight. And your goal is just to make sure that the knight survives till the end of the game. Question is, do you think that if you say, you are playing the knight, you're playing the tower, I'm playing the queen, and your goal is to survive, my goal is to survive, do you think that by doing that, we will play overall a game that has any chance of winning against the opponent? No, it doesn't. That's
quite misleading, the goal that we're trying to solve.
Yes, and people say, oh, in 99% of the game we have played, I was playing the knight, and the knight was still on the board by the end of the game. Yeah, but we lost every single game.
So it looks good, but the game wasn't.
That's the problem with misleading metrics, is that it may sound and it may look super rational, while actually at the core it is deeply irrational. And I believe this sort of forecasting practices and forecasting divisions that many larger companies have are completely irrational. And I know it's very tough because those divisions are full of engineers who want to do good. They are not idiots, and their bosses and the people above them, they are not idiots either, and they want to do good either. So you see, this is not a problem of having people that should be fired or whatever. No, it's the whole setup is just
counterproductive.
Counterproductive, exactly. It cannot, it's broken by design. It will not achieve. So my advice would be make sure that you have this one person. This person can have as many peers as you want, to have backups.
One end of the
that connects
chain to
the raw data to the final decision. And that should be, a monolithic optimization. You should not slice and dice this process.
Joannes, thank you very much for this topic today. Indeed, very thought-provoking. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.